Thunder had never refused to enter the stable, not once in 8 years. But that morning, the horse planted his hooves in the dirt and backed away like the wooden structure held death itself. Caleb Thorne stood in the doorway, watching his most trusted companion shake his massive head with a violence that made the bridle chains rattle. The same stable Thunder had entered 1,000 times before now seemed to terrify him. The same stall where he'd spent countless peaceful nights now made him rear back with wild eyes. Something was wrong, deeply wrong. Caleb had built this stable with his own hands 15 years ago when he first claimed this isolated stretch of land. Every board, every nail, every corner had been crafted with precision and care. Thunder had been coming here since he was barely more than a colt, following the same routine every evening without question. But now the horse circled the entrance, nostrils flaring, ears pinned back against his skull. His breathing came in sharp, panicked bursts. When Caleb tried to lead him forward, Thunder jerked the rope so hard it burned through his calloused palms. "Easy, boy," Caleb murmured, his voice steady despite the unease crawling up his spine. "What's got you spooked?" The horse's response was to back away even further, his hooves scraping against the packed earth. Thunder's eyes remained fixed on the stable's interior, but not on any particular spot Caleb could identify. It was as if the entire structure had become something to fear. Caleb examined the stable walls, searching for anything that might explain the sudden change. No broken boards, no strange sounds, no unusual scents he could detect. The hay was fresh, the water clean, the stall exactly as it had been the night before. Yet Thunder acted as if stepping inside would mean his death. For 3 hours, Caleb tried everything. He offered oats, spoke in soothing tones, even tried entering the stable himself to show there was no danger. But Thunder remained planted outside, trembling with an intensity that made Caleb's chest tighten with worry. As the sun climbed higher, neighbors began to notice the commotion. Old Henrik from the adjacent property wandered over, his weathered face creased with curiosity. Behind him came Marcus, a local worker who'd helped with various farm tasks over the years. "Never seen Thunder act like this," Henrik observed, scratching his gray beard. "That horse has always been steady as stone." Marcus nodded, his dark eyes studying the animal's behavior. "Horses sense things we can't. Maybe there's something inside we're not seeing." Caleb felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. Thunder's terror was absolute, primal. This wasn't the reaction of a horse startled by a mouse or disturbed by unfamiliar sounds. This was the behavior of an animal that sensed genuine danger. But what danger could possibly exist in a stable Caleb had built, maintained, and used safely for 15 years? As Thunder let out another shrill whinny and backed away from the entrance, Caleb realized that whatever was frightening his horse wasn't something that had recently appeared. It was something that had been there all along, waiting to be discovered. By midday, word had spread to 3 neighboring properties. Farmers and ranch hands arrived to witness the spectacle of Thunder's inexplicable terror. Some brought their own horses, thinking Thunder might follow their lead. But even the most docile animals grew agitated near the stable entrance. Caleb tried a different approach. He led Thunder to the back of the stable, hoping to enter through the rear door. But the horse's reaction was identical, violent head shaking, backing away, nostrils flared wide with panic. Whatever was inside affected the entire structure. "Maybe it's the smell," suggested Elena, a sharp-eyed woman who raised cattle on the neighboring ranch. "Animals have senses we've forgotten." Caleb stepped inside the stable alone, breathing deeply. The familiar sense of hay, leather, and wood filled his nostrils. Nothing seemed different. Nothing seemed wrong. Yet Thunder's behavior suggested otherwise. He began a systematic search, examining every corner, every beam, every inch of the structure. The wooden walls appeared solid and unchanged. The floor showed no signs of disturbance. The hay was fresh, the water clean, the tools exactly where he'd left them. But as he moved through the stable, a nagging feeling grew stronger. Something about the proportions felt off. The back wall seemed closer than he remembered. The stable felt smaller somehow, as if the interior didn't match the exterior dimensions. Marcus joined him inside, carrying a lantern despite the daylight. "Found anything?" "Nothing visible," Caleb replied, though his voice carried doubt. But Thunder's not acting this way for no reason. They spent the afternoon examining every detail. Marcus tapped along the walls, listening for hollow sounds. Caleb measured the interior, comparing it to his original construction plans. The measurements were close. But something nagged at him. As evening approached, Thunder's agitation only intensified. The horse paced in wide circles around the stable, never approaching within 20 feet of any entrance. His distress was so acute that Caleb was forced to tie him to a post near the house, far from the structure that had once been his nightly refuge. Other animals began exhibiting strange behavior too. Chickens refused to venture near the stable. The barn cats, usually curious about every corner of the property, avoided the area entirely. Even the dogs seemed uncomfortable, whining and backing away when encouraged to investigate. "Animals know things," Henrik said as the group gathered in the fading light. "My grandfather used to say that when all the creatures agree, you'd better listen." Caleb nodded, though his practical mind struggled to accept such reasoning. He was a man who built things with his hands, who solved problems through logic and hard work. But Thunder's terror was undeniable, and now other animals were confirming what his horse had tried to tell him all day. That night, Thunder refused to settle anywhere near the stable. Caleb was forced to fashion a temporary shelter near the house, far from the structure that had housed the horse safely for 8 years. As darkness fell, Caleb found himself staring at the stable from his kitchen window. The building looked exactly as it always had, solid, familiar, harmless. Yet something inside had changed fundamentally enough to terrify every animal on the property. Tomorrow, he decided, he would begin tearing apart the structure he'd built with such care 15 years ago, starting with the wall that seemed to make the interior smaller than it should be. Because Thunder's terror was trying to tell him something, and Caleb was finally ready to listen. Dawn brought no relief. Thunder remained agitated, pacing the makeshift enclosure Caleb had constructed near the house. The horse's eyes never left the stable, as if watching for some threat to emerge from within. Caleb armed himself with a crowbar and hammer, determined to investigate the wall that seemed to compress the stable's interior. But as he approached the structure, Thunder's distress escalated to a pitch that made neighboring dogs howl in response. "Easy, boy," Caleb called out, but his voice carried less conviction than before. Thunder's terror was beginning to infect him too. Inside the stable, Caleb focused on the back wall. When he pressed his ear against the wood, he heard something that made his blood run cold. Not silence, as he'd expected, but a faint echo, as if there was empty space beyond the boards. The wall should have been solid. He'd built it against the natural slope of the land, with no room for anything behind it. Yet the hollow sound suggested otherwise. Marcus arrived as Caleb began examining the wall more closely. "Find something? This wall isn't what it should be," Caleb said, running his hands along the weathered boards. "Listen to this." He tapped the wood in different spots. Most produced the solid thunk of boards against packed earth, but in one section, about 4 feet wide, the sound rang hollow. "There's space back there," Marcus said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "But that's impossible. I helped you build this wall. We packed earth right up against it." Caleb's memory of the construction was clear. 15 years ago, he'd positioned this wall against the natural rise of the land, creating a solid barrier. There had been no space, no gap, no reason for the hollow sound they were hearing now, yet the evidence was undeniable. As they examined the wall more closely, other details emerged. The boards in the hollow section were slightly different in color, as if they'd been replaced or added later. The nails holding them were newer, their heads less weathered than those in the surrounding wood. "Someone modified this wall," Marcus observed. But when? And why? Caleb tried to remember any time in the past 15 years when he'd worked on this section. Nothing came to mind. The stable had required minimal maintenance, and he'd never had reason to alter the back wall. But the evidence suggested that someone had. Someone had created a space behind the wall, then concealed it so carefully that even Caleb had never noticed. Thunder's whinnying grew more frantic as they continued their investigation. The horse seemed to sense they were getting closer to whatever had been hidden from view. "Should we open it?" Marcus asked, though his tone suggested he dreaded the answer. Caleb gripped the crowbar tighter. Whatever lay behind that wall had been deliberately concealed. Someone had gone to considerable trouble to hide it, to make it appear as if the wall was solid and unchanged. But Thunder's terror suggested that whatever was hidden wasn't meant to stay that way forever. The horse's instincts were warning them about something that demanded to be discovered. As Caleb positioned the crowbar against the first board, Thunder's distress reached a crescendo. The sound was unlike anything the horse had ever made, a cry of pure, primal fear that echoed across the isolated property. Whatever was behind that wall had been waiting 15 years to be found, and Thunder somehow knew it was finally time. The first board came away easier than expected, as if the nails had been loosened by time and moisture. Behind it, Caleb glimpsed darkness, a void where solid earth should have been. "There's definitely space back here," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Hand me that lantern." The light revealed a cavity approximately 4 feet wide and extending deeper than the lantern's glow could penetrate. The walls of the space were lined with rough stones, creating what appeared to be a crude chamber built into the hillside. Marcus stepped closer, then immediately backed away. That smell. Now Caleb detected it too. A musty, organic odor that spoke of things long buried and undisturbed. Not the clean scent of earth, but something that made his stomach clench with instinctive revulsion. "This wasn't here when I built the stable," Caleb said, though even as he spoke, doubt crept into his voice. "I would have noticed a cavity this size." But memories could deceive. 15 years was a long time, and the construction had been arduous work done mostly alone. Could he have missed something this significant? As they removed more boards, the cavity's dimensions became clear. It extended back into the hillside for at least 6 feet, creating a chamber large enough for a person to stand upright. The stone walls showed tool marks, evidence of deliberate excavation. "Someone dug this," Marcus observed, "recently enough that the stones haven't settled." Caleb examined the stonework more closely. The construction was rough but functional, the kind of work done by someone who knew how to build but was working quickly. Most unsettling, the stones near the entrance showed darker stains that could have been moisture, or something else entirely. Thunder's cries continued from outside, now joined by other animals expressing distress. The dogs had begun howling, a sound that carried across the valley and brought more neighbors to investigate. Elena arrived as Caleb prepared to enter the chamber. "What have you found?" "Hidden room," Caleb replied grimly. "Built into the hillside behind my stable wall. If you were Caleb, what would you do? Enter that dark chamber despite every instinct screaming danger? Or seal it back up and pretend Thunder's terror meant nothing? Tell me in the comments. I need to know which side you'd choose. Because what Caleb decided next would change everything he thought he knew about his own property. Taking a deep breath, Caleb stepped into the chamber, lantern held high. The smell grew stronger, decay mixed with something metallic that made his teeth ache. The floor was packed earth, but irregular, as if it had been disturbed and hastily smoothed. "Caleb," Marcus called from behind him. "Look at the far wall." The lantern light revealed what appeared to be scratches in the stone, marks too regular to be natural erosion. As Caleb moved closer, the scratches resolved into something that made his hands shake. Letters. Crude, desperate letters carved into the stone with what must have been fingernails or small rocks. Most were illegible, worn away by time and moisture. But one word stood out clearly enough to read: help. Below it, carved with the same desperate urgency, were numbers. A date from 20 years ago. Caleb's mind raced. 20 years ago, he hadn't even owned this land. The previous owner had been a reclusive man named Jeremiah Slate, who'd sold the property and moved away without explanation. "We need to search this chamber thoroughly," Elena said from the entrance, though her voice carried the same reluctance Caleb felt. As they began a systematic examination, more carved messages became visible, fragments of words, desperate pleas, and dates spanning several months 20 years ago. The carvings told a story of someone trapped, someone who had spent considerable time in this stone prison. But it was the discovery in the corner that made Caleb's lantern slip from his trembling hands. A pile of cloth, rotted with age but still recognizable as clothing. And beneath it, something that gleamed white in the lantern light. Something that made Thunder's terror suddenly, horribly, make sense. Bones. Human bones, yellowed with age and partially concealed beneath the rotted fabric. Caleb's lantern cast dancing shadows across what remained of a human skeleton, positioned as if the person had died curled in the corner of the stone chamber. "Dear God," Elena whispered from behind him. Someone was imprisoned here. The reality hit Caleb like a physical blow. For 15 years, he'd been housing his horse directly above a makeshift tomb. For 15 years, he'd walked past this wall daily, unaware that someone's remains lay just feet away from where he stored his tools and feed. Marcus backed away from the chamber entrance, his face pale in the lantern light. "We need to call the authorities. This is a crime scene." But Caleb remained transfixed by the carved messages on the walls. Now that he understood what had happened here, the desperate scratches took on horrifying clarity. Someone had been trapped in this chamber, alive, with enough time to carve pleas for help into solid stone. "Look at this," Elena said, pointing to a section of the wall near the skeleton. More writing. Caleb directed the lantern toward fresh carvings, clearer than the others. The letters spelled out a name. Sarah Collins, and below it, "Tell my family." The name meant nothing to Caleb, but Elena's sharp intake of breath suggested recognition. "Sarah Collins disappeared 22 years ago," she said. "She was a teacher at the local school. People assumed she'd left town suddenly, but her family always insisted something had happened to her." The pieces began assembling themselves into a nightmare scenario. Jeremiah Slate, the previous property owner, had somehow imprisoned Sarah Collins in this hidden chamber. The rough construction, the hasty concealment behind the stable wall, the desperate messages carved in stone, all evidence of a crime that had remained hidden until Thunder's instincts finally exposed it. "That's why Slate sold the property so quickly," Marcus said. "He knew what was buried here." Caleb's hands shook as he held the lantern. When he'd purchased this land 15 years ago, he'd thought he was getting a fresh start. Instead, he'd been unknowingly maintaining a grave, walking daily over the remains of a woman who'd died begging for rescue. Thunder's terror suddenly made perfect sense. Horses were sensitive to human remains, able to detect the presence of death even through wood and stone. For 8 years, Thunder had entered the stable without incident, because he'd been young and less sensitive. But as he'd matured, his instincts had sharpened until they could no longer ignore what lay hidden beneath. "We have to contact the sheriff," Elena said firmly. "Sarah's family deserves to know what happened to her. If you're enjoying the story, subscribe to the channel." Caleb nodded, though part of him wanted to seal the chamber back up and pretend this discovery had never happened. His peaceful property would now become the center of a murder investigation. His stable, the structure he'd built with such care, would be dismantled and examined as evidence. But Sarah Collins had died calling for help, and her family had spent 22 years wondering what had become of her. Thunder's refusal to enter the stable had finally given her a voice. As they prepared to leave the chamber, Caleb noticed something else. Near the entrance, partially hidden beneath loose stones, lay what appeared to be a metal object. He brushed away the debris, revealing a tarnished locket on a broken chain. Inside the locket was a photograph of a young woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile. On the back, an inscription, "To Sarah, with love, Mother." The woman in the photograph would never see her family again, but at least now they would know she hadn't abandoned them. Thunder's terror had finally brought her home. Sheriff Clayton Morse arrived within the hour, his weathered face grim as Caleb led him to the hidden chamber. Behind him came Dr. Rebecca Hayes, the county coroner, and Deputy Williams with his camera equipment. 22 years, Sheriff Morse said as he examined the carved messages. Sarah Collins has been missing 22 years, and her family never stopped looking. The investigation transformed Caleb's property into a crime scene. Yellow tape surrounded the stable, and officers methodically documented every detail of the hidden chamber. Dr. Hayes worked carefully to preserve the remains while searching for additional evidence. Thunder remained agitated throughout the process, though his terror had diminished to nervous pacing. It was as if the horse understood that his purpose had been fulfilled, the secret had been exposed, and the proper authorities were finally involved. This chamber was constructed specifically to hold someone prisoner, Dr. Hayes observed as she examined the stone walls. The entrance was designed to be sealed from the outside. There's no way the victim could have escaped without help. Sheriff Morse's investigation quickly focused on Jeremiah Slate, the property's previous owner. Records showed that Slate had sold the land to Caleb just months after Sarah's disappearance, accepting far less than market value and leaving no forwarding address. Slate was questioned during the original investigation, Sheriff Morse explained to Caleb, but he had an alibi for the day Sarah disappeared. We never had cause to search his property. Elena had contacted Sarah's family, and her elderly mother arrived that afternoon. Mrs. Collins was a frail woman in her 80s, but her eyes still held the sharp pain of a mother who'd never stopped mourning her lost child. She was coming home from the school that Friday evening, Mrs. Collins told Sheriff Morse with quiet dignity. Sarah always took the path through these hills because she loved to watch the sunset. She never made it home. The path Mrs. Collins described passed directly through what had been Jeremiah Slate's property 22 years ago. Sarah's regular route would have made her an easy target for someone who knew her habits. As the investigation continued, more details emerged. The carved dates in the chamber suggested Sarah had been held prisoner for several weeks before dying. The scratches on the walls told a story of desperate attempts to escape, of someone who'd fought until the very end. She was a fighter, Dr. Hayes said quietly. The evidence suggests she never stopped trying to get out. Marcus helped dismantle the false wall completely, revealing the full extent of Slate's construction. The chamber had been carefully planned, with ventilation holes that were too small for escape, but sufficient to keep someone alive for an extended period. This wasn't a crime of passion, Sheriff Morse concluded. This was premeditated. Slate built this prison knowing exactly what he intended to do with it. By evening, the immediate investigation was complete. Sarah's remains would be taken for proper examination, but Dr. Hayes was confident about the identity. The locket, the carved name, and the circumstances all pointed to the same tragic conclusion. Mrs. Collins asked to see the chamber where her daughter had died. Despite Sheriff Morse's gentle protests, she insisted on entering the stone prison that had held Sarah's final days. "Thank you," she said to Thunder as she passed the horse's enclosure. "Thank you for not letting her be forgotten." Thunder approached the fence for the first time since the discovery, allowing Mrs. Collins to touch his muzzle. The horse's agitation had finally ceased, replaced by a calm that suggested his burden had been lifted. That night, as the officials departed and the crime scene tape fluttered in the evening breeze, Caleb stood looking at the dismantled stable. The structure he'd built with such care was now just scattered lumber and exposed stone. But Thunder stood peacefully in his temporary enclosure, no longer tormented by the secret that had haunted the property for 22 years. The horse's refusal to enter the stable had finally given Sarah Collins the voice she'd been denied for more than 2 decades, and somewhere in town, an elderly mother was preparing to bury her daughter at last. 3 weeks later, Sheriff Morse returned with news that brought both closure and justice. Jeremiah Slate had been found living under a false name in a distant state, his carefully constructed new identity unraveling under investigation. "He confessed," Sheriff Morse told Caleb as they stood where the stable had once been. "Couldn't live with the guilt anymore, especially after hearing we'd found Sarah. He's been carrying this secret for 22 years. The confession revealed the full horror of Sarah's final weeks. Slate had become obsessed with the young teacher, stalking her daily route home from school. When she'd rejected his advances, he'd kidnapped her, believing he could eventually make her love him. The stone chamber had been his twisted attempt at creating a place where Sarah would be dependent on him, where she would have no choice but to accept his presence. But Sarah had never stopped fighting, never stopped hoping for rescue, carving her desperate messages until her strength finally failed. Thunder had sensed what human investigation had missed for over 2 decades. The horse's instincts had penetrated the carefully constructed lies and exposed the truth that Jeremiah Slate thought he'd buried forever. Sarah Collins received the funeral she'd been denied 22 years earlier. The entire community attended, including Caleb and Thunder. Mrs. Collins had specifically requested that the horse be present, crediting him with finally bringing her daughter home. "Animals know things we've forgotten," she told Caleb after the service. Thunder felt Sarah's presence when the rest of us had given up looking. Caleb rebuilt his stable in a different location on the property, far from the stone chamber that had become Sarah's tomb. The chamber itself was carefully filled and sealed, transformed into a memorial garden that Mrs. Collins tended with loving care. Thunder never showed fear of the new stable. He entered willingly, peacefully, as if understanding that his mission had been completed. The horse had carried an impossible burden for months, sensing the presence of death but unable to communicate what he knew, until his refusal to enter became too obvious to ignore. The story spread throughout the valley, becoming legend among the local ranchers and farmers. People spoke of Thunder's sensitivity, of how animals could perceive truths that humans missed. Several cold cases were reopened, as families wondered if their missing loved ones might also be hidden in places where animals feared to tread. If you're enjoying the story, subscribe to the channel. Jeremiah Slate was sentenced to life in prison, though his advanced age meant justice came decades too late. He died 2 years later, taking with him any remaining secrets about other crimes he might have committed. Mrs. Collins visited the memorial garden every week until her own passing 5 years later. She was buried beside her daughter, their headstones marking the end of a 22-year separation that Thunder's instincts had finally resolved. Caleb continued working his ranch, but he never forgot the lesson Thunder had taught him. When animals spoke through their behavior, wise humans learned to listen. The horse had shown him that some secrets refuse to stay buried. That truth has a way of demanding recognition, no matter how carefully it's concealed. Thunder lived peacefully for another decade, never again showing the terror that had consumed him during those crucial days. He'd served as Sarah's voice when she could no longer speak for herself, proving that justice sometimes comes through the most unexpected messengers. In the end, Thunder had done what 22 years of human investigation couldn't accomplish. He'd brought a murdered woman home to her family and ensured that her killer finally faced the consequences of his crime. The horse's refusal to enter a stable had become Sarah Collins's final victorious plea for help. Now click on the video on the screen to hear a story even better than this one, with a mystery so deep you won't see the truth coming until it's too late. Click on the video now.